Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. If you're not familiar with the Libertarian Angle or the Future of Freedom Foundation, I would invite you to come and visit our website at fff.org, where you'll see practically every Monday the lead article is by my co-host of this show, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, Richard, the news media is reporting the imminent threat of a government shutdown. Now, this is kind of like music to libertarian ears, but boy, they're starting to panic and freak out, and oh my gosh, the sky's going to fall in if the government shuts down. Now, several years ago when I saw this circus going on, they were drawing a distinction between essential government services and non-essential. And so the fact is that even though they talk about the government shutting down, it doesn't seem like the government's really going to shut down. It's only what they call the non-essential functions. Well, of course, my question is, if something's non-essential, why not just shut it down permanently? Especially when you've got a budget deficit where the government's spending a lot more money than what it's bringing in tax revenues, and adding to the ever-increasing mountain of debt that's hanging over the American taxpayer. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on here, the framework behind this budget debate and what's happening?
Okay, well, last year, the Congress decided to vote, both Republicans and Democrats went along with this, to have a continuing resolution to carry the government's spending around till the end of April of this year, basically to avoid budgetary issues that would concern the electoral cycle in 2016. So they basically had kicked down formalizing the full budget for the fiscal year 2017, which officially began on October 1, 2016. That's the federal government's budgetary cycle, October 1 to September 30th. And so basically now there has to be a decision made by Congress and signed off by the president to continue the funding for the current fiscal year, that is through September 30th, 2017. Now, the dilemma here that has arisen is that the Democrats say that they'll only go along with a budget resolution to keep it going through September if the Republicans accept not just a temporary, but the permanent principle of government subsidization of the insurance companies that are going bust because of Obamacare. On the other hand, Trump is pushing the Republicans to say that in any such budgetary agreement, the funding has to be there for the wall along the Mexican border. The Democrats say no, the Republicans say no, and this is the dilemma, supposedly. And this has to be decided before the end of the current week, that is by around April 27th, April 28th. For the government, quote, not to come to a screeching halt. Now, in the world of the libertarian dreams, the idea of the government coming to a screeching halt, I've died and gone to heaven. Hallelujah, saved at last. However, this is not quite the way it works. There have been a variety of shutdowns over the years. The last one being in 2013. Briefly, I believe it was for 14 or 17 days. But this is basically, as you were saying, essential and non-essential service. This is what will not be affected by a shutdown. The armed forces will continue to be paid and to serve actively both at home and abroad, including military actions abroad. So in spite of a budget shutdown, Drone planes will continue flying. Missiles might be dropped on some unfortunate people in a foreign country. Uh, the National Security Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, the NSA, the snoopers into our nooks and crannies of our lives, they will continue to function because they are essential to keep Americans safe. What else will keep funding? The Internal Revenue will not shut down because the servants of the people must assure that the taxpayers keep sending in their money out of their paychecks through their employer withdrawals and withholding, so that the government continues to have funds in spite of this shutdown. There will be workers there will be certain things that will be shut down. And I know this is going to be shocking for many of us, but the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. might be shut down. So your vacation might be disrupted. Oh no, you can't take the elevator up to the top of the pinnacle. National parks will be likely shut down, so that will disrupt people's vacations. A number of government offices and licensing bureaus will shut down. And so a variety of workers will be furloughed. Now, you'd think that if a person has been furloughed, he's not going to work. And if he's not going to work, he's not doing his job. And if he's not doing his job, he shouldn't be eligible for his pay. Psst, think again. This means that when the shutdown ends and all those temporarily furloughed workers return to work, even though they may have been doing nothing, sitting at home for days or even weeks, they'll be paid retroactively for all of their furloughed relaxation and rest and recuperation. So basically, this is all smoke and mirrors. Government will go on, defense spending, taxing and surveillance spending and activities, a whole variety of things. The departments will not shut the doors and the key will be turned into some office. There will be skeleton crews of personnel at each and every department, bureau, and agency of the federal government. What will be visible, and which is meant to arouse the ire, resentment, frustration, and anger of the American public, is that the visible things, like getting a small businessman or other company needing to go through some investigating or licensing procedure. The Food and Drug Administration, for example, will not stop investigating private companies in their production activities. It's meant to just frustrate visibly the taxpayer that somehow this is dangerous and evil. Now, of course, exactly what you said. If something is non-essential, then why is it operating to begin with? It's gratuitous. It's basically an irritant. Now, in fact, I personally like government shutdowns. In fact, when Ronald Reagan passed away, except for those, quote, defense and surveillance agencies, virtually the entire federal government shut down for a day for Ronald Reagan's funeral. I personally thought that was a good thing, even though I knew that they were being paid for their day off. I'd rather pay them to sit at home and not irritate, intrude, control, manipulate, and prohibit the things I want to do in my life. In other words, I'm willing to pay like a protectionist racket to leave me alone. Unfortunately, they're not going to leave us alone. They will be active and present and just go about their business when the smoke and mirrors of the game is played and whatever deal is cut, business as usual.
All right, well, explain to me this. I mean, we're often told that Congress has the power of the purse, and that, for example, on these foreign bombs that you mentioned, that will continue to be fired, dropped, and missiles fired, and more death and destruction at the hands of the Pentagon and the CIA in the Middle East and elsewhere. We all know there's no declaration of war, that what they're doing over there has been illegal from the get-go under our form of government. But people sometimes respond to say, look, if Congress really wanted to shut this down, they have the power of the purse. They're the ones that appropriate the money. And if they want to shut down these forever wars, all they have to do is just refuse to appropriate money for them. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but when there's no budget approved, doesn't that mean that Congress has not appropriated money for these activities? And if Congress has not affirmatively appropriated money for those activities, what's the justification for continuing them? Doesn't the whole thing come shutting down as a result of our form of government?
Because what will basically happen, first of all, there are things called continuing resolutions. During the Obama administration, for instance, many of the federal government's fiscal years went by without a formal budgetary approval. There'd be these ad hoc passing of individual bills, and then when they needed renewal, if the Congress could not really reach a conclusion among themselves, they would pass a continuing resolution. We're going to just let the spending continue at its current levels for its current activities because we've not agreed more formally on the entire structure or details of the budget. Congress will have passed a resolution that these essential functions that I enumerated, at least some of them that I enumerated a few minutes ago, will continue as is. That the military will stand at the parapets of freedom around the world. That the IRS will continue overseeing the collection of taxes. The Social Security checks will continue to go out, for example. All these are legislatively determined. So it's a game that they will have given the authority for this to continue. Oh, by the way, there is one federal employee's salary that is guaranteed to continue regardless of any of this, because that has come under a separate congressional act that can't be touched. Congressmen and senators will see no lapse or break in the receiving of their paychecks. Yes, that is a separate legislative category. The entire country and the government could shut down, but your local senator and congressman will continue to receive his paycheck. So that's basically how they will have passed these continuing resolutions so that things go on even though they're supposed to shut down.
All right, well, we refer to these things as essential services and non-essential services because that's really the way the government previously referred to them. Many years ago when there really was this so-called shutdown, I forget how long it lasted, but I think it lasted weeks, and the non-essential personnel suffered a severe self-esteem problem. Psychologically, they were thrown into depression because they were labeled non-essential people. Yes. And so they decided to reevaluate the whole system so that in future shutdowns they would no longer draw this distinction between non-essential and essential in order to protect the self-esteem of the workers. And I'm not sure how they draw it now. But my feeling is, Richard, is that after that last time, whenever that happened, 2013, that they cannot afford to have a shutdown, either side, because people then figure out nothing happens. That the country doesn't crater, the oceans don't submerge the United States, the whole country doesn't collapse into nothingness. There's not a communist takeover. In other words, they can't afford to let the shutdown go on too long because people might say, hey, what's wrong with this?
Right. Well, you see, the thing is that it's basically a public relations thing. Each of the Republicans and the Democrats, from their respective point of view, and say that they've drawn lines in the sand that cannot be broken. We are dedicated, in the current situation, to preserve the health insurance and coverage of the American taxpayer and citizen. We demand that the Republicans continue permanently with the funding of the bankrupt health insurance companies that have been sucked into funding and providing Obamacare coverage. The Republicans, we have drawn a line in the sand. Our president has said we have to keep that riffraff from entering the country, that riffraff and terrorists from entering the country. There has to be the funding for the wall. Though, of course, to be honest, there are many Republicans who have not been Trump supporters. They may not be purely libertarian, but they're often not Trump supporters. And they would be happy if the wall was not funded because they feel uncomfortable with the very concept of it. But the Republican Party has basically been told by the White House this is, if the president is going to sign a budget, right, because the Congress passes it and then it goes to the president for signature. If the president is going to sign it, so these things like the wall have to be in, the funding of the wall have to be in there. So they each can posture and position themselves. They will eventually reach some solution, whatever it is. And they will have been able to say, we stood firm, and yes, it cost the American people certain things, but principles were defended, and then to save the country, we finally made a deal.
Well, let's focus on the wall here. That Trump campaigns on the principle that he's going to build this Berlin kind of wall or Chinese wall along the southern border to keep out Mexican immigrants, and that he's going to make Mexico pay for it. So the whole idea the entire time was that the American taxpayer would never be shouldered with the enormous expense. I mean, billions upon billions of dollars to actually, I guess they have to tear down the fence they already have to build this huge wall, and the eminent domain to take away people's property to build this thing. So the thing's going to cost a lot of money, and he always said Mexico's going to pay for it. Now, he never made it clear how to do that. It seems to me that the only way that he could really do it is to invade Mexico and steal whatever is in their coffers, or steal Pemex, the national oil company, or just do what President Polk did back in the 1800s, generate a provocation and just take over the half of Mexico that Polk did not take over. Well, of course, that would cure the illegal immigrant problem from Mexico, then is the rest of Mexico would now be part of the United States and everybody be an American citizen. But apparently that's all fallen through the cracks now, because Mexico, not surprisingly, is saying we're not paying a dime for your stupid wall. And so now Trump has to say, well, okay, I guess I can make Mexico pay for it later. I think that's what he's saying. And now I want Congress to appropriate all this money to build this wall. And so how does he reconcile this, Richard, after he told everybody that it was going to be free, at least free for the American people?
Well, I think it's the same way that he has reconciled virtually everything that has been a contradiction of his promises since he came into office. He said that he would narrow and reduce American foreign military involvement around the world. Well, he has bombed Syria over, admittedly, a tragic chemical attack on civilians. He has used this mega conventional bomb in Afghanistan against supposedly Al-Qaeda and Taliban storage facilities hidden within mountains. He has threatened military acts against North Korea, and even gave the false impression that there was an aircraft carrier armada heading towards North Korea, when it turns out they're heading for the Indian Ocean. But the fact is that he makes these changes, and with like everything else, it doesn't seem to matter to his supporters. Perhaps some of the viewers and listeners have seen the recent polls over the last few days, that among the core supporters of Trump, those who voted for him, either enthusiastically or even moderately as the preferred choice, his support among these people has virtually not gone down. They say they support him. They know it's a rough road. He has obstacles, but he's our man. So in terms of his core base, it hasn't mattered. Now, of course, for everyone else, Democrats who loathe him from their own point of view, and Republicans, either the more reasonable conservative or even some of the semi-libertarian Republicans, who found him unacceptable from the start, they haven't been won over. So nothing has changed. And I think that since Trump really hasn't done anything to try to reach out to those who opposed him, he seems to be only concerned with that core. And that core is loyal to him, no matter how much he fudges and changes his message or his actions. So there's been no cost to him to do this.
Yeah, I read that his support has actually increased compared to Clinton. That a lot of people would today that voted for Clinton say that they would never vote for her again, or would not have voted for her again. And but not the same with Trump. His base is staying solid. Tell me a little bit about the other side of this thing, though. You got Obamacare that's factoring into this, where Trump campaigned on the principle that he was going to repeal or get Congress to repeal Obamacare, that he was going to stand fast. And isn't that part of the debate here over this looming government shutdown?
Absolutely. Now, let's sort of make some conceptual distinctions. If one is a principled and attempted consistent classical liberal or libertarian, the idea that government should be involved in healthcare in any way, shape, or form is inconsistent with the abiding principle of individual liberty, freedom of association, and freedom of choice within the marketplace. Setting that aside, okay? So what is going on? What's going on is that after talking for 7 years about repealing Obamacare, now it came up to a decision. And the conservative caucus in Congress, which may not be radically libertarian, but would prefer to see a significantly reduced role of government in healthcare, with certainly more competitive open market choices for the citizenry. From the things I've read, I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners have followed, were shut out of the mainstream discussion over the Health Care Act that Paul Ryan then put on the table, and which failed because he couldn't get enough Republican, basically conservative members of the House to support it. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, have said that Obamacare, it needs a little tweaking, but it's basically sound and essential, because how can any civilized country in the modern world not guarantee health care to every citizen, because it's a human right? And so they're insisting, in spite of whether it's a Ryan reform or a more, maybe not libertarian, but more market-oriented reform by some members of the conservative caucus in the House, that they're willing to not put up with any of that, that it has to be guaranteed that the subsidies will continue to fund the health insurance companies who are hemorrhaging losses in terms of the premiums they can charge, but the outflow of claims that are arising because of the people that have joined the healthcare system through the Obamacare mechanisms. So this has become a major dilemma. Now, Trump in this process said at first that he supported Ryan. He got irate that the conservative caucus was balking from, admittedly, again, not a libertarian point of view, but a more limited government, more market-oriented point of view from their perspective, blew this thing up. And he said, I'm not going to work with the Democrats. Well, of course, Democrats don't want to work with him. So now they're supposedly putting together a new package in which the mainstream Republicans and the conservative caucus seem to have been playing nice and touchy-feely. So they still have their own version that Trump has said is going to be presented, but it still involves a reduction of things that the Democrats insist upon. And this means that whatever comes through now is going to not be a free market solution. It's going to be either the Obamacare version that the Democrats are proposing, or some Obamacare light that is more palatable to the more conservative members of Congress, but is far from the ultimate privatization of healthcare, get the government out, libertarian point of view. And this is the stumbling block here as well. And again, any way that this comes out, this is another way perhaps to think about it, Jacob. Regardless of what the compromise is on Obamacare funding, and regardless of what may or may not be funded for a wall, either part, full, temporary, promised, the end of the day, that whatever compromise arises, so the rest of the fiscal year can be officially funded one way or another, will involve more government, more spending, and ultimately more taxes and or more government borrowing. This is a game that only leads to government growing in its scope, its content, and its cost. This is a debate that may or may not partially shut down some activities of the government, that has nothing to do with the underlying question of what is the role, duty, and function of the government in a free society.
Yeah, because you're ultimately going to end up having more crises. I mean, that's what this system produces. It produces crises. You've got a welfare state, you've got a warfare state. And however this thing is resolved, as you point out, you're going to end up having these crises, which then means more anxiety, more depression among the citizenry, and more demands for government to do something about the crises that are rooted in the welfare warfare state. I mean, we see this time and again. Regardless of whether they build a wall or not, you're going to have an ongoing immigration crisis. Same crisis has been going on since the 1950s and probably even before. That you've got this socialist system of central planning for immigration, where the government's allocating quotas and making restrictions on who can come in. It's just central planning. And we know what that produces. It produces crises. And then when they get the crises, everybody thinks, well, we can't get rid of the cause of the crisis, the immigration central planning. We have to have more interventions and more rules and more regulations, more criminal punishments, and finally a Berlin kind of wall. We see it with the drug war. One intervention leads to more interventions until you end up having a police state, both in immigration and the drug war. We see it in Social Security. We see it in overseas interventions in the Middle East. Like, we've got these forever wars now that have been going on for, 25 years now. They never stop. Bigger and bigger bombs, more and more missiles, more and more assassinations. And they only create more crises that then call for more intervention. So you hit the nail on the head. What Americans need to be doing is right now, with all this circus of this debate and another debate that's upcoming, the debt ceiling debate, that what Americans need to be doing is asking that fundamental question, the question that we have focused on since our inception 27 years ago, Richard. What is the role of government, the legitimate role of government in a free society? Should it be doing these things? Should it be engaged in socialist central planning? Should it be involved in health care and retirement, charity, overseas interventions, and so forth? And once you arrive at the right answer to that, everything else resolves itself, because government is no longer involved in those areas and therefore isn't spending the nation into bankruptcy to fund them.
Right. If I can just add a caveat or amplify something that you pointed out a few minutes ago, which deals with this fundamental issue. Is private property sacred? That is it recognized as the inviolable right for people to earn the income that enables them to buy real property, and as long as they don't violate the equal rights of others through violence, fraud, and so on, to not be molested in the private and peaceful use of their property. Certainly Republicans and conservatives have traditionally said that they advocate that. Yet if this wall is built along the southern border, and the media itself in some instances have had reports about this, is the dozens, if not hundreds, of property owners along the Texas border on the Rio Grande, or property owners on the Mexican border in Arizona and New Mexico, who their property abuts right there at the border. And if this wall is going to be built, that is all going to have to be declared eminent domain. And many of these private citizens have said that they're going to take the government to court. This is going to be not only a violation of their property rights, but a huge cost to private citizens to try to protect that which is peacefully theirs, that the government should not be attempting to take away from them, in the idea of setting up a labor protectionism that prevents people from peacefully and honestly entering the United States to go about the private affairs that they want to undertake in peaceful voluntary association with others living in the United States. This will be a terrible further abridgment of the right of private property in the name of this absurd walling off of the United States from a part of the world.
Yeah, and we've already seen part of it with that fence that they built. The news media was reporting a couple weeks ago about one family whose home was closer to the border, but they couldn't put the wall behind the home for whatever reason, ecological reasons or whatever. So they built the fence in front of their home, so that their home, in order to get to the home, they have to go through the fence, through a locked gate. They said that we effectively feel like we're part of Mexico now. because of where they located the fence, and we're going to see much more of that in the future. I think we also should mention the way they fund all these activities in this budget and all the expenditures they have for the welfare warfare state. That libertarians stand against income taxation, and well, we stand against all taxation, but especially the income tax, because it is such an assault on private property. And we should keep in mind, before somebody suggests, oh, well, that's just not practical, that America lived without income taxation for over 100 years of this country's history. And that's because our American ancestors understood that income taxation, especially progressive income taxation, is a grave infringement on the private property rights of citizens. They believed, as we libertarians believe, that people have a right to keep everything they earn and the right to decide what to do with it, including investment, spending, charity, hoarding, or whatever.
Yeah, the principle upon which this country was founded is the inviolable right of the individual to his life, liberty, and his honestly acquired property as the means to pursue his personal happiness. Anything that government does that does not narrowly and specifically operate to secure those liberties are violations of a person's freedom. If I can just make one more example about the absurdity of the border business. I assume it's still in effect, but shortly after 9/11 happened, the border with Canada was tightened, as well as obviously the border with Mexico. And I forget the name of the town, but there's a town on the upper New York State Canadian border. And some wealthy benefactor back in the late 19th century decided to build a library, donate a library to the community that was right on the border. In other words, half of the library is in Canada and half the library is in the United States. And you would enter from two entrances, and you could be passing, going through the book stacks and the magazine racks between Canada and the United States. But after 9/11, Canadians were not allowed to cross the line to grab a book from another shelf because it was on the American side, and vice versa. The American could not sit on the Canadian side to read that latest issue of an interesting magazine. I mean, the absurdities of this are just, I mean, this would be a comedy skit if it wasn't so tragic.
Yeah, it's truly amazing that people put up with this and continue to put up with this. And there is a solution there. That's libertarianism all across the board. But on that note, Richard, we need to wrap things up. We're out of time. For those of you, again, that are just getting acquainted with the Future of Freedom Foundation, I would invite you to tune in on our show. This is our weekly show, Libertarian Angle, that Richard, Ebeling, and I co-host. We've also got articles that we publish every single day. I have an article on my blog every day, and Richard publishes an article once a week for us, and we link to a number of other articles. And our mission is to present this uncompromising case for libertarianism. Our website is fff.org. Richard, greatly enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, and thank you to the viewers and listeners for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in. See you next week.